Pokemon Generations League is doing their 15th season of draft. Honestly, feels incredible to say that because I've worked with this league for generations now, quite literally. Very bad pun. I am so sorry, meme, for that. But we're here today doing another power ranking video for the Pokemon Generations League. If you guys enjoy, of course, make sure to like and subscribe and check out the Pokemon Generations channel where they cover all of their different season breakdowns. It's been really cool actually to get to be a part of this. I think this is my third time doing power rankings for them. I know I did an Uber season and I know I did one other season. It might have been another Uber season. I'm genuinely spacing. But now, this is my first time doing a doubles season, which is pretty cool. I've been doing a lot of doubles for all of Scarlet and Violet, pretty much since actually about a month or so before. For context, I've been laddering a ton in the VGC setting, and even before the month before Scarlet and Violet, I've actually done a lot of VGC practice or just format in general in the past. I did a good amount of VGC 16 where I made a lot of top 4 at locals, losing to Aaron Trailer every single time as my top 4 opponent. I've done some VGC 17 where I did a lot of different events at mid-season showdowns. So I've done enough VGC, but this was my first generation where I ever tried VGC draft. I did a couple different team tours, and then I also did about 3 different VGC leagues. So I wouldn't say I'm the most versed person, but I know enough of what to not do at this point. So we can go off of that and try and see how you guys can avoid some of the mistakes that I've made in the past, especially with them still being pretty fresh off of my recent WBG season. But yeah, with that said though, let's get into the teams that we're going to be ranking today. So there are 16 different coaches. We're going to go from the 16th best to the very best, of course, just like how any typical power ranking video would do. I'm going to try and keep these down to just a couple minutes a team. I know that sometimes power ranking videos can be very long, and I want to try and just get to the point, especially when I don't know enough to be super in-depth with this format, but I do know enough at least to talk about things like glaring issues or things that are more surface level, which should hopefully, at least for a lot of you guys who might be watching, just be a good introduction to the VGC draft format. I know there's not a lot of VGC draft content on YouTube, and also not a lot of people who play a lot of VGC draft, so I'm sure that a lot of people really just need to know where to start. So I'm hoping that with this power ranking video, this will be a good way to do so, especially with this being one of the first ones that I've personally seen actually cover the Reg D format. But with that said, let's get started with our number 16th team, which is going to be none other than the Scarlet Division's own Unknown Pingu, coach of the Birmingham Weasels. Now, this team consists of Iron Valiant, Scizor, Gyarados, Crocodile, Raichu, Mesprit, Hisuian Typhlosion, Revavroom, Appleton, and Crocolore. And now you might be wondering how a team like this could end up actually being 16th. If you've played a lot of singles, for example, Iron Valiant is already one of the best Pokemon in singles, and it feels like it would be a pretty standout Pokemon in this sort of setting. With mons like Gyarados and Crocodile, you have yourself a nice dual Intimidate core. Mesprit's a pretty good Trick Room setter, and there's some other decent picks too, like Crocolore, I guess, offers Unaware support, and also Appleton can have some niche against things like Dozagiri and other similar types of archetypes that are very specially offensive, well, especially defensive, I should say. And in this particular case, I do have a couple issues with the team. And while I think that this team has some of the better mons on our Category 3 teams, so Category 3 teams are going to cover all of the teams that, in my opinion, are in the bottom tier. I know a lot of times with power rankings, you know, they're up to opinion, but I try to break these down to 3 different sections. The bottom tier, which are the teams that I think are definitely like the lower end, with the middle tier, which are the teams that I think at least, well, quite literally, it's bottom, middle, top. There's not really a lot going into this. But with the bottom tier teams in particular, I actually think that Pingu probably has some of the best individual Pokemon if we just talk about the Pokemon individually. But there are a couple big glaring issues. For one, with the best mon here being Iron Valiant, I feel like compared to a lot of other teams, especially this early in the draft, this is actually a pretty lackluster pick. When there were still Pokemon like Roaring Moon, for example, Chiyu, Fluttermane, Urshifu, I feel like that going with pick 1 Iron Valiant might not have been the best choice. If this doc isn't in pick order, by the way, this actually changes Pingu's placement probably to like 15th or 14th in my opinion, because a huge point in this was the fact that there was such an early Iron Valiant pick, and that ends up actually being pretty underwhelming when you look at a lot of the months that were still around, obviously, considering only Ursaluna and Dragapult had went at this time. Even outside of that though, I wouldn't exactly say that this team ends up being, actually, yeah, so I did just find another tab. It looks like this was actually the 15th pick team. Honestly, now that I'm saying that out loud, though, I don't actually think I'm going to change the placement. I feel still confident in the fact that this is probably the 16th team. Mostly because of the fact that even building around Iron Valiant, one, there were still better mons. I'm looking at Chiyu, which went with Amoonguss as the wheel. So there were definitely still better picks. And even looking at the round 2, there were still a lot of mons I would arguably would have taken round 1 sooner than this. Like, old Dango was a great one. Jugulus honestly would have been an okay one even. Furgraph was pretty cool support and would have offered a lot for a more expensive round 2 pick. King Gambit and Rillaboom were both phenomenal round 1 mons. Heatran would have been an insane round 1 option in this format. Then we get into like round 3, and I could keep going on and on. There was a lot, like Lando T was a round 3 pick, for example. So there were clearly not a lack of round 1 Pokemon, and that wasn't why this ended up happening. It's really just, I think, Singles Brain that saw Iron Valiant, and that's a top tier mon in singles, but honestly, it doesn't really do a lot in VGC. It's slower than a lot of different fast booster threats, for example. It's gonna really struggle to do a lot in terms of a fast mode of the team as well, considering all of the speed control is oriented towards a slower team with things like Trigger Mesprit, for example. Realistically, I think Iron Valiant, to actually be a really good top tier mon and truly win games for this team, will probably need to partner with Electra Raichu in more games than it would like to. And I think that with stuff like that, it feels really that a lot of the strong parts of this team do bank off of Series 1 foundation, which already is going to be a huge disadvantage compared to a lot of these teams. Still though, despite being a 16th ranked team, really besides the Iron Valiant issue, which is such a glaring issue in my opinion in every facet, I feel like a lot of the other team actually works pretty well. Gyarados Raichu is a pretty solid core, and the Dual Intimidate as well with Crocodile is pretty solid. Scizor is really great with Terra, actually. Mesprit's a really good cheap Trick Room setter. Soothing Typhlosion is okay. I mean, for 9 points, it's actually a pretty okay special attacker, to be honest. And Revavroom can be decent with Terra. So I think this team has some decent foundation. It could certainly do some really good job at winning. But at the same time, though, I feel like just the clunkiness with Valiant alone warrants this at 16th, because it was the first round pick, and the team is actually hurting Valiant's usage significantly, in my opinion. Moving on to team number 15, though, we do have none other than Christian, who is going to be the coach of the Double Draco Droppers. Now, this team consists of Ursaluna, Ironmoth, Magnezone, Oranguru, Gallade, Noivern, Sneasel, Avalugg-Hisui, Mismagius, and Impidimp. And right off the bat, I think this team does have a couple really big issues. For one, I don't actually think that most of the team is synergy. We do have some synergy for sure. I think that, for example, the Magnezone is pretty decent, despite obviously not having the best synergy with every single Pokemon here. It's really good at trapping a couple particular threats, especially Corviknight for Ursaluna. Was that way then you could just start mauling with ground move and normal move into most matchups, which I guess it fills one particular matchup, but at the same time though, I probably would have just gotten Magneton for that, since this is a 12-point Magnezone. Though I will say that Magnezone probably fits a little bit better on Trick Room than Magneton does, so to each their own, it does kind of work here. But really, outside of Oranguru, Ursaluna, I don't actually like the team. I think that Oranguru, Ursaluna, though, truthfully, is such good synergy, and they'll carry through so many games just slaughtering opponents with guts boosted attacks that this is worth it enough. And with mons like Hisui and Avalugg, which actually I think Avalugg-Hisui was a pretty decent value pick at 6 for this team, I think it at least offers something. You know, it's a nice backup option to clean games with stuff like Rock Slide and Mountain Gale. But again, I'd be lying if I said I thought this team was really good. I think mons like Noivern and Sneasel just are kind of thrown on here for checklist for speed. Gallade is not terrible on here actually, but I feel like it just doesn't really serve a lot of purpose. I don't know. I think there's options in this team for sure. Realistically, though, I would probably gut everything below Oranguru besides Hisui and Avalugg and maybe Mismagius and just completely redraft all those Pokemon. Actually, I would keep Impidimp too. So just redraft the Sneasel, Noivern, Gallade. I think that it's a waste of budget considering you're spending 26 points on that out of a total of, I think this is like about 110 point total. It's either 110 or like 100. It's not a lot of points, and considering the fact that you are burning through 26 of them on those 3 Pokemon, they don't offer a lot to this team. I feel like it's a huge waste of points. Moving on, though, we do have our number 14 team being none other than Cram, who is going to be the coach of the St. Louis Battle Haluchas. Now, I definitely recognize Cram from having been a previous contender. I didn't recognize all these names, but Cram's name is definitely one. That particular team name especially is what I recognized it off of the second I saw this. So Cram is a very familiar face to me in the Pokemon Generations League. I know they've played in a few different seasons of this, considering I think I've recognized them from both my other Power Ranking videos. But this team ends up being kind of okay. It consists of Mousehold, Armarouge, Torrentee, Gastrodon, Mimikyu, Bellibolt, Lokix, Sneasel, Hisui, Leafeon, and Sliggoo Hisui. Now, I think this team definitely was supposed to not end up being like it was. If I had to guess, the Battle Haluchas were looking to get Annihilate round 2, and I feel like honestly I would have probably gotten the Ape round 1 if that was the intention in the Mousehold round 2, because I feel like Ape would have been a lot stronger of a start here. If the intention truly was to start off with Mousehold, I don't really think that they picked a great round 2 mon with it, considering Armarouge is actually not a great partner with it, so outside of maybe Weak Armor beat up. Torrentee is kind of whatever. It's a fast Tailwind mon, I guess, but it's not fast for Tailwind mons, and this team doesn't really need Tailwind anyway. Gastrodon's a pretty cool pick. I only like the Mousehold, Armarouge, and Gastrodon partnerships, and then I think that the Mimikyu and Bellibolt is kind of okay here. But once you start to get into stuff like Lokix, being probably arguably the best fast mode this team has. Sneasel Hisui is kind of whatever, but it could be a lot worse, frankly. It's good speed for the team, and I think it actually kind of helps well with stuff like armor synergy. I feel like this team really does just kind of rely on the fact that Indeedee and Annihilate both did not go on this team, and it hurts significantly with the usage. That's really my only issue with it, is I think that either Indeedee or Annihilate could have made this into like a top half team, and it's missing both. So there's not a lot to offer, really. I think this team is just barely missing out on a lot of different areas, and not having Annihilate or Indeedee is the big reason for that. Otherwise, you kind of have like basic stuff, but it's nothing too impressive either. In the Mons using it, like Torrent, for example, isn't the best in BGC. Even in a draft setting, I probably wouldn't really get Torrent personally. I don't think it's that good, especially for 12 points. I think, frankly, most of the cheaper Mons offer more. Like even Belly Bolt at 7, for example, I think gives a lot more versatility than Torrent would in this format. But regardless, though, neither here nor there. Moving on to number 13, though, we do have our next Scarlet coach being Quick, coach of the Dallas Dash Buns. This team consists of Great Tusk, Iron Jugulus, Tinkaton, Dondozo, Salazzle, Gardevoir, Abomasnow, Frost, Rotom, Sojourner, and Misdreavus. And I think this team actually is a really solid team in terms of specific Pokemon. The issue being, though, is I think that this team, despite starting off really well with stuff like Tusk and Jugulus and having some decent niche support with stuff like Misdreavus and Sojourner, I don't really think that a lot of the cores were finished. For example, getting a Hail Core but then banking off of Rotom Frost as your Hail Up user probably would have just ditched Rotom Frost at that point. Going with Dondozo but not going with Tatsugiri. I think Dondozo Giri could have worked on this team, but solo Dozo, I feel like, is arguably a handicap here. It just drafted specifically to get a wall on the team, when you don't really need a wall in this sort of archetype, in my opinion. Especially when you already have such good physical defense from things like Abomasnow and Hail, Great Tusk. You didn't really need the Dondozo on top of that, in my opinion. Overall, I think this team is actually pretty okay. I think it's objectively just an okay team. But I think, sadly, though, it feels like it's just short of actually being a really good team. And I think realistically that kind of all falls on Dondozo. And I'd probably just drop Dondozo and Rotom Wash. I'm not really sure for specific Mons, but I would probably look into something with those and maybe get a different water type with that. And then Rotom can honestly just be whatever. And I think that would fix a lot of the issues this team has, really. I think they just kind of fall into those two Pokemon in particular. For our final team in the bottom tiers, we do have our number 12 coach being Bleedle, who is going to be the coach of the Jollibee-Drills. The Jollibee-Drills, yes. Now, this is the Annihilate team, consisting of Annihilate, Rotom Wash, Toedscruel, Grafaiai, Garganacl, Slacking, Hydreigon, Quillfish, Dunsparce, and Phalanx. Now, I think this team actually has some decent modes. For example, Slacking and Grafaiai will objectively be a pretty solid mode this team can run, considering the Doodle Strat is pretty impressive. Ape is objectively a good carry. Rotom Wash has a lot of good anti-meta presence, and it's always just a really good draft Pokemon. But when we start to get into things like the speed tiers being base 100 as the peak, the fact the only Trick Room setter here is going to be Toedscruel, in fact, that a lot of this team does get really clunky at either like the base 30-40 mark or like the 85 to 100 mark speed-wise, and there's not really a good in between here. I think this team will definitely be pretty easily prepped around. There is enough scary threats here, though, with stuff like, again, the Doodle Grafaiai. Annihilate on its own can honestly just solo most teams, even in VGC draft. That thing is a monster. Rotom Wash is pretty good to snowball teams, and especially with the Grafaiai support, there's enough that can work here, but I think this team is just, again, it feels kind of fractioned off, which is my issue with a lot of these bottom half teams. It feels fractioned off from otherwise really good strategies. Now we're going to get into our middle tier teams. These are going to be our ranks 11 through 6 teams. This would consist of teams that are most likely just probably barely meeting the mark, or at least hitting the acceptable mark for what makes a good team. All these teams are pretty even with each other, in my opinion. And starting off, we do have our number 11 team being Suit Dumpling, coach of the Garling Growlithe. This team consists of Chiyu, Amoonguss, Sneasler, Thundurus, Therian, Iron Leaves, Staraptor, Tatsugiri, Tauros, Spiritomb, and Whiscash. Now, I actually think that every single Pokemon on this team has a viable presence. I'd even argue that Whiscash actually can be kind of okay on this team, especially with Trick Room. The Mon hit's kind of hard with the Choice Band. You could do some decent work with it. But overall, though, I think the team just kind of lacks synergy. It's just good Pokemon, but lacks any synergy. For example, starting off with Chiyu. Chiyu is probably one of the best special attackers you can get. Good speed tier. Having a Amoonguss as well with that. This was a really strong wheel pick from this team, and I think that going Sneasler round 3 with Thundurus Therian, again, really good. But when you start to factor in things like, for example, the lack of a Psychic Terrain, or just any Terrain Pokemon for that matter, to pop with Bird and Sneasler. The fact that you're also missing things like Dondozo with Tatsugiri. The fact that you have no good fast special breaker with Chiyu, and the fact that your fastest special attacker with Chiyu is going to be Iron Leaves. I think this team just barely missed out on a lot of things that could have brought it into the top 5. I think if even one of these things was present in this team, this would have been a top 5 team. Because just adding a terrain setter meant that Sneasler is now going to be one of the fastest Pokemon in prep, if not the very fastest Pokemon in prep. And that alone could have helped a lot with Chiyu, just for some early game shenaniganry, you know, leading off with like Chiyu and Sneasler and then doubling into something else to either let Chiyu just get a free breaking turn if Sneasler's not going to be useful, or just letting Sneasler be more of an offensive win con here, and then switching out Chiyu, because Chiyu does put up enough field presence on its own to actually merit that switch. I think as well, you could have maybe just went with like a fast special attacker. I know things like Flutter Mane probably would have been idealistic, of course, but really any fast special mon could have probably been good there. For example, if we look at other things that went round 2, because this was the wheel pick, keep in mind, even a mon like Sandy Shocks could have probably been better here, because if nothing, actually no, never mind. The Thunderous pick was actually very later on. Holy shit, that was round 7. Never mind. Okay. You know what? Maybe Thunderous was the best pick, but I probably would have just started prioritizing maybe Spiritomb over, Spiritomb. For example, that Spiritomb actually, if we even just look at like round 4 and 5 mons, that could have been something like Inteleon. Inteleon could have actually been kind of cool here. Maybe would have went for a spread Pokemon, to be fair. But Inteleon, if nothing else, just going for even just Hydro Snipes with like a minus special attack could have actually been pretty damning for teams. But if we continue down the line, of course, we do have things like Raichu, which could have also definitely been around. And Raichu actually would have also been pretty cool here. We can continue going down the list, and we see mons like, I don't know, actually a lot of the, I will say credit where due, a lot of stuff ended up being a lot later on, but one of the big mons that I'm seeing, probably the biggest mon I'm actually seeing that could have been really cool here, was Enamorus. Now I know that Enamorus at least isn't a ton faster than Thunderous, but I feel like the setup options for this are a lot more versatile, and you could have had a lot more variance regarding the physical versus special sets, and I think you could have also probably taken a lot better advantage of things like Sneasler and Amoonguss with Enamorus than having Thunderous. So it's not to say that I think that there was suddenly a ton of options that could have went here, but at the same time, though, I feel like that, I don't know, I feel like there was just barely something that could have been a top tier team here, and it's still fine. I think this team will still have a good chance at playoffs, as is even, but I think it could have been like a really top tier team, and it's really just a huge missed opportunity. Going into number 10, though, we do have Maxi, who is going to be the coach of the Booming Bathgate Blacephalons, another coach who is a very familiar face to the Pokemon Generations League scene. Now, Maxi is a pretty solid team, actually, with a team consisting of Dragapult, Corviknight, Ferrograph, Weavile, Lucario, Florges, Toxtricity, Clawitzer, Alolan Raichu, and Camerupt. None of the mons actually are bad by any sense here. I think they all actually have some pretty good presence, and realistically, any game I feel like you could viably bring any of these Pokemon to, which is already a huge leg up. I think even teams that are higher ranked don't really have that sort of luck with their team for their full draft. The biggest issue I have with Maxi's team, despite having all good mons, they all mesh well together. Things like Frigg and Pult are pretty good. They just got second at Worlds. Corviknight's a really good unique Tailwind setter, and it's probably the only good bulky Tailwind mon in my opinion, and it helps a lot with Dragapult synergy in general. Weavile is a pretty good fast option here even, but my biggest issue with this team though is the fact that everything here either relies on Terra to deal damage or relies on an item to deal damage. And by item, I specifically mean like consumption of an item, like Throat Spray Toxtricity, for example, or like some sort of, I don't know. The point being is that, yeah, it's really, I guess, just Throat Spray Toxtricity or like some sort of choice item or Terra. It's really the only way this team does a lot of good damage breaking. It has a lot of modes that it can do really well. For example, Trigger mode with things like Camerupt and Claw can be really viable. You have Tailwind with things like Pult, Toxtricity, Alolan Raichu, etc. You have really good Fake Out support. You have good ways around even Protect with stuff like Faint, Weavile, and Lucario that are both pretty viable. Terra Normal E-Speed Lucario is just a lot cheaper of a version of Dragonite as well, considering that was only a 10-point mon versus Dragonite being 14. There was a lot that can be done with this team. I just think that everything that relies on Terra on this team hurts us so much, because you're going to only be able to really Terra one Pokemon, obviously. And I feel like to get any sort of mileage or any legroom in any given game, the whole team needs to Terra, arguably. Otherwise, it's a good team, but it's just so terrifying that I can't put it higher than 10th. Next on our number 9 spot, we're going to have the Cyber Gamer YT, who is going to be the coach of the Scandinavian Sceptiles. This team consists of Cresselia, Rillaboom, Dugtrio, Alola, Goodra, Rotom Heat, Overqwil, Basket Legion, Pelipper, Floette, and Sudowoodo. Now, I'm going to be honest, I did rank this team number 9 with a really big preface on that Alolan Dugtrio round 3. Now, I will say, looking at the doc here, I still can't tell, actually, because I'm getting mixed different things. It looks like that the Alolan Dugtrio might not have actually been the round 3 pick. Looking at that draft tab, which I will say, definitely I would look into, whoever does the doc work for this, I would probably look into that, because I know it's not in ABC order. it looks like it's just like I can't even actually tell what. So I know what the draft order is supposed to be, right? But just a side note for whoever makes this doc, I would probably look into keeping it consistent between the draft and the rosters tab, because it's not even like ABC order or anything like that. It looks, I don't know. Again, just a little side note. Actually, it looks like this is a free agent pick. Okay, so that actually makes a lot more sense. I'll give a little bit of credit where due then. I did make a point of that in my notes. Even still, though, honestly, these teams are still pretty even in terms of viability. So the Scandinavian Septiles free agenting, that is kind of fine, actually. It does help a little bit with notes in general. It looks like that actually used to be Halucha, so I can kind of get that. Personally, looking at this, actually, I do like the original team a bit better, if I'm going to be honest. I think that realistically all the good mons are still there on both teams, but things like, for example, the Halucha, I think could have actually been a really huge mon for this team, and I would argue that Gabite was probably a little bit better of a low tier pick than like a Sudowoodo, for example, but I can kind of get why. Yeah, honestly, I like the team originally better. That might be a bit of a hot take. Oh, actually, never mind. There's no Pelipper. Ooh, yeah, I can see why you made the trades. I don't know. I think realistically this team isn't bad. I think it's objectively just a fine team. I actually really don't have a lot of notes on this one. It's probably the one I have the least amount of notes for, considering, I shit you not, Alolan Doug Trio took up half the notes here, and it was pretty simple. The team does what it needs to, has good rain modes. Rillaboom and Cresselia are just objectively good Pokemon. They offer a lot of versatility, and they're great enablers. It's just objectively a fine team. I don't really think it's a great team. I don't think it's a bad team. I understand this is probably a bit like underwhelming for Cyber Gamer, but it's kind of just there. I think it'll have a good chance at playoffs. I don't think it's a guaranteed playoffs though. There's nothing that I think really deems this team objectively just winning through games. That might have changed, I will say, if Basket Legion female was Basket Legion male. But I understand that probably was obviously just difference in points, and also just I think it might have even been an availability thing at this point. But let me double check that. Let me see. So Basket Legion, no, this was the only one drafted. And there's probably just a difference in points thing, really, because if we look at Basket Legion, it was a whole 2-point difference, which might not sound like a lot, but when we look at this team and considering they're banking on mons like Floette and Sudowoodo, that could actually make the difference there, to be fair. What I would personally recommend maybe looking into, though, is dropping Sudowoodo Basket Legion for just a 1-point mon. Honestly, because Sudowoodo is not coming to games, and Basket Legion male, I think, would make a huge difference in damage. Otherwise, the team is pretty good. It's just an objectively fine team. I don't even think you need to make the transaction for the record. The team could definitely do some work as is, but I just think it would be a bit more helpful. Moving on to the top half, though, still in the middle tier, we have JS Kerf, who is going to be the coach of the Winnipeg Jet Punches. This team is Urshifu, Single, Goldengo, Walking Wake, Talonflame, Azumarill, Mudsteel, Luxray, Thwackey, Grumpig, and Vigoroth. I think this team is a lot that it does really well. For example, Goldengo is a really great Tailwind mon, and in tandem with Talonflame, that's going to be doing some serious damage. Walking Wake as well could be pretty valuable, and especially when Talonflame could very viably just set Sunny Day for it. Despite obviously not having Prankster like a mon such as Tornadus would for this Pokemon. At the same time, though, it at the very least is still fast enough to just viably set Sunny Day and let Walking Wake deal some serious damage here. It's a team that can benefit from Sun, but doesn't really need it either, which is huge. Shifu is great at just covering Goldengo checks here too, and Goldengo is great at covering Shifu checks. I think this team does a lot for itself really well. My biggest issue, though, is the fact that the Trigger mode does kind of hurt a lot of the very best mons on the team besides Azu, and the Tailwind mode is going to be pretty relied upon because of the fact that mons like Goldengo and Urshifu will be so reliant on it, and Talonflame I think will just end up dying too early in the game most times, just because of the fact that there's kind of a lack of a good backline that could enable Talonflame to switch in and out freely. It's not to say it's a bad team. I think this team could definitely win a lot of games in 3 or 4 turns, which would be enough. But the issue being, though, is that when you are playing in a draft setting, it's going to be a lot harder to do that than just hopping on the ladder and doing that. This team would easily snowball on ladder, I think, even with just like the top 5 mons, but the issue being is that we're not, and you kind of know what these sort of teams are going to be doing in prep. It's still fine. I think you can still definitely be a strong playoff team, but that's really it for this one.
And we are back. Sorry for any continuity ruined. I had to take a couple-hour break to get the first part edited. I guess also just let my neighbors mow their lawn. But also it was very hot, so I was running the AC for a bit. So we are set. We have ranks 7 through 1 to now rank. The next team that we're going to be ranking is Eltriss's team, and Eltriss is going to be the coach of the, sorry, I got to pull this up. They're going to be the coach of the Alolan Geysers. And this team is pretty interesting, actually. It's a team consisting of Chien-Pao, Enamorus, Incarnate, Sandy Shock, Hisui, and Arcanine, Jumpluff, Slitherwing, Swalot, Sableye, Cloyster, and Girafarig. So a couple things that I had that honestly really impressed me. One, the mon quality on this team is insane. This is one of the first teams that I felt like not only had truly good cores, but also had cores that actually put a lot of field presence on, to the equivalent of where I guess the ranking is. And I guess even in the middle tier, I think really the thing holding us back is the fact that I don't like the lower tier value a ton. While mons like Cloyster and Giraffrig definitely do have a niche on this team, when we get into what they actually will be bringing, I don't think it's going to be much. Really, I think that everything besides Sableye and then the top 6 is probably not going to end up being featured, so the team will end up getting a bit predictable in my opinion, but it's one of those teams that can kind of afford to be predictable, because when you have Chien-Pao and Hisuian Arcanine, and you just start spamming Terra Normal, Bandit, E-Speed from Arcanine, while also then dropping your opponent's attack with Intimidate, or just going for a Rock Head next to Sword of Ruin Chien-Pao, like you're not really just taking those hits, and your opponent knowing that they're coming in prep isn't really going to hurt you that much. And Amorous is probably the only actually fluid piece on this team, which is kind of fine. The next most fluid mon is probably Cloyster, unironically, and then after that it's Slitherwing, and purely Slitherwing gets a nom here because of the fact that you can technically invest photosynthesis-wise to boost a couple different stats. If you go with things like Timid Nature, for example, you can get speed. But the point being is that you don't really get a lot of mileage out of versatility in this team, but everything it does so well that you could probably just get away with that in most games. I think the team definitely does have merit, but frankly, I unironically think that Sableye will be a huge carry here. It does give a lot more aspects to the team, like for example, Arcanine can rely on a lot more of the fire sets to just start breaking teams, even without Chien-Pao being on the field, or with obviously Slitherwing you can benefit, same as Sandy Shocks for that matter, without having to run booster speed on these Pokemon, which could actually be pretty big. Not needing the boost energy is actually going to be pretty huge, because these Pokemon can start running things like Life Orb, you can start running things like Assault Vest, Citrus Berries, etc. Like, the sky's the limit at that point. So I definitely do think that this team has options, but the mons in particular that are going to be coming to games, I think are kind of limited to 7 personally. But it's a 7 that could definitely work. Getting into our final team in the middle tier, though, we do have Nono, who's going to be our rank 6 team. Now, this team consists of a pretty strong balance consisting of Urshifu Rapid, Heatran, Zapdos, Arboliva, Persian Alola, Donphan, Uxie, Avalugg, Fletchinder, and Skiploom. Right off the bat, honestly, those top 3 are pretty strong, and it does give a lot of different options in any given week. This team is kind of the exact opposite issue that Eltriss's team had, in where, while I think that Eltriss's team is definitely pretty predictable, I think Nono can bring every mon, but outside of the top 4, I would argue, the mon quality goes down pretty significantly. Uxie's not the best Trick Room setter this gen, and it's actually pretty passive when you get into mons in its point range, where looking at the other 9-point Trick Room options, we can even just start listing through things like the 10 to 8-point range that were available. For example, Bronzong is completely free, Espathra is completely free, though Espathra is not the best Trick Room mon, I would argue. We do have Slowbro Galar, which I actually think Slowbro Galar could have been a pretty interesting option on this team. I'm not huge on a lot of the lower point value, and I think maybe something like an Avalugg or a Donphan could have been dipped down a point, or even a low in Persian for that matter, just to make sure that you're getting that Slowbro Galar, which I think could have been pretty decent here. But even just in terms of 9-point mons, Articuno Galar could have been decent despite stacking another flying type on this team. I think it would have been worth the investment personally. There's a lot of taken mons here, to be fair, but I think really the big one in 9 that honestly I'm kind of shocked it just wasn't added to this team, because I think it would have benefited a lot, was Weirdeer. Now, Weirdeer I think could have actually been an interesting one, and I do hope that Nono does consider picking this up, because Weirdeer does add an actual Intimidator to this team, and despite stacking a second normal type with Arboliva and another mon that could potentially not really appreciate switching into fighting types, Zapdos is already a pretty good check to most fightings that you'd see on the board, and frankly, the team will just break past most of the viable fightings. For example, Iron Hands will get pretty easily bullied by things like Donphan, and any sort of Terra Grass Donphan, or any ground check on Iron Hands for that matter. I meant Terra Grass Iron Hands for the record. But any sort of those checks would just start getting mauled by things like Heatran and Zapdos. So I don't really think that's a huge issue. But even if we wanted to, let's say, dip further, let's say Weirder wasn't really on the table. We do still have mons like Espeon, which can kind of suit us at Trick Room, but I'd get why that was passed on. 8-point didn't really have anything. We could have probably went with Hisuian Braviary and 7, which could have been good value. The point being is that there were definitely options, I think. While I don't think that Uxie was terrible, I do think it's a little bit passive. And even outside of Uxie, though, really my big issue lies with the Donphan, actually. I think Donphan was a huge waste of points for 9. But other than that, I mean, my guess is they were probably trying to count for like a Mud Sail or something and just didn't get it. I don't think the team is bad by any means, though. I think realistically it's just shy of being a top 3 team, but I think really it's just going to kind of bank off of those very high top four mons, and then the team will ride or die off of them. I will say that the very cheap value though in mons like Fletchinder and Skiploom was very, very well done. Skiploom will obviously be a really good Rage Powder option, and with a Violet, this thing can be pretty deceptively bulky. Meanwhile, with Fletchinder, you have the Gale Wings priority, and we know that Talonflame is done with that, and having a 3-point Talonflame that really you're going to do pretty much the same roles with, just having less damage with Brave Bird, is definitely valuable. I will say though, Fletchinder will kind of just live and die by Tailwind and not really get the same viability you get out of things like Sunny Day and Taunt on Talonflame because your speed is significantly slower on Fletchinder. But at the same time though, with a mon like Fletchinder, you just need it for that priority Tailwind, and getting that priority Tailwind on a 3-point Pokemon is really lethal. So I like Nono's team a lot. I think it has some merit. It can definitely get some really good wins, in my opinion. I just think that mons like Donphan and UC and Olo and Persian, those 9 points really, I think all the 9-pointers and then maybe Avalugg are mons that could have truthfully just been better picks. But who knows? The team definitely has enough going for it. All the mons can come to games. I just think that there probably were a better composition of those points, albeit it would have taken a lot, and frankly, I still think it's a fine use of points. Finally, though, we're going to get into the top 2 teams. Now, these are the 5 best teams. It just so happened this number happened to be 5. That wasn't really the intention to do 5 here, but it happens to be 5 different teams that I think represent the really highest points of the draft. Starting off, we do have Zan's team. Now, Zan's team I think is actually really cool, and personally, I'm kind of shocked this team existed, but the team consists of Grimmsnarl, Lando T, Spectrier, Goodra Hisui, Quaquaval, Braviary, Fungus, Delphox, Oricorio, and Vavroom. Now, I will say, I looked at the draft page for this, and I saw that Lando T went round 3. I don't know how Landorus went round 3, but at the same time, though, I do think that I think the Spectre was a bit of an early grab, though my guess is that the coach Zan ended up just wanting to get the round 1 Spec because Spec at least does have a really threatening tower presence and a high speed tier that at least without boost strategy, it's one of the highest you can get. So I can get why Zan might have picked this up, and frankly, Lando is a little bit easier to prep around in draft. It doesn't have the same presence you have in VGC where you just slap a Scarf and just win most matchups, or slap an Elvis and just win most matchups, or Rocky Helmet and just win most matchups. In VGC draft, I think it's a lot more predictable to play around. And Max Point Lando might not have been the best, but at the same time, Max Point Lando around 3 is suddenly a really good pick. I am purely just talking about it might not have been the best like as a round 1 pick, which Zan didn't get as a round 1 pick, so it's fine here. But honestly, that Spec, Lando T, and Grimcore is really deadly. And when you throw in Hisui and Goodra as well, that benefits a ton from not only the Grim screen support, but also from the Lando T Intimidate. And I think this team is the first one where I actually have really no issues with it. Zan's team, I think the worst thing about it is that there's not a slow mode, which all of the other top 4 teams at least can take advantage of opposing team slow modes. This one's really just with Goodra and Grim, though at the same time, this team has so many ways to either just outright nuke most Trick Room setters, or at least dissuade them from clicking Trick Room, whether it's valuing targeting a Pokemon in Zan's side, or just things like Taunt Grim, for example. I think there's a lot that Zan can definitely do, and I would be very shocked if this team didn't make playoffs. I think it's genuinely a top 5 team, and I think the 3 through 5 teams are all pretty even with each other, same as the 1 and 2 teams, but they're all in the top tiers for sure. I would be shocked if any of these 5 missed playoffs by our coach just not knowing what the fuck VGC was. Anyway, going on to our number 4 team, we do have Amarillo, who's going to be coach of the Dallas Tyrannostars. Now this team consists of Roaring Moon, Palafin, Arcanine, Iron Treads, Iron Thorns, Rabscab, Medicham, Wigglytuff, Quillfish, Hisui, and Tropius. Right off the bat, one of my favorite things about this team is that we already have a very nice start with essentially just a Palance score, or at least as reasonable as you could have gotten one in draft. Obviously, you were not going to get a Mungus, Fluttermane, Palafin, Arcanine. That's insanity. If someone really got that, it's draft creation. I refuse to believe you drafted that unless you conned people out of it. But having Roaring Moon, Palafin, Arcanine already is an insane backbone. This was a huge core in Series 2, it's a decent start in Series 3, and most of these Palance teams did have Moon on them anyway, and the ones that didn't had Tinglu. So realistically, I mean, this is already a huge starting point, and having mons like Iron Treads as well actually benefits us a lot. Iron Treads is a really good fast option for this core in case you don't want to run Booster Speed Roaring Moon. You can maybe go with like a Booster Speed Iron Treads, same as the Iron Thorns, which can actually be a really decent Trick Room breaker for this team. The loaded dice for Iron Treads could be decent for breaking most Palafin checks. Things like Bulky Waters and Bulky Grasses are going to get pretty easily shattered by Iron Thorns, whether it's just going for things like Wild Charge or if it's going to go for moves like Loaded Dice plus Pin Missile. It's a pretty decent partner, though it might not look like one on paper. It covers pretty much any reasonable Palafin check in the game. I like a lot of the lower picks too. Things like Rapska, for example, with Revival Blessing could be huge for reviving Palafin late game, allowing it to be a lot more of a reckless breaker early on, or even a mon like Arcanine just to intimidate cycle late game. You have things like Medicham with the skill swap Pure Power, which could get rid of the potentially useless abilities on Iron Thorns and Iron Treads for a really good damage breaking one, which in my opinion is actually huge. Roaring Moon will probably be the booster energy mon of choice in most games, maybe not everyone, but most, leaning you to maybe want to take advantage of those high attack stats and the pretty decent overall bulk and speed on Iron Thorns and Iron Treads respectively. So that Pure Power Medicham, while also being a really good Trick Room mon for the team, could be a decent takeout support or skill swap option here. The Wigglytuff is Wigglytuff. This will take advantage of potential incoming Intimidate and just maybe competitive boost. For 4 points, it's a pretty decent option, and the typing is pretty unique. Quillfish, decent 4-point Intimidator. T-Spikes are great. Typing, only having one weakness is great. And then Tropius has some really good support. Like, I think this is a coach who clearly knew what VGC was, and while I don't think they have the objective best draft, I think it's more so on potency is the issue with this one. It has objectively a really safe team, and frankly, I could definitely get someone even arguing this is the best draft in the pool. My issue is just I feel like this team is almost too safe. I think every team above this one has something that they kind of risk, and I think it paid off in my opinion personally. This one feels like the equivalent of a VGC ladder player who tried to hop on the ladder for the first time and decided, you know what, let's just run a bunch of standard teams that did really well in tournaments. And they were like, you know what, for this VGC draft league, let's just remake one of those. And they did a good job at that. I just think that for draft, you might need to take a little bit more of a gamble, but at the same time, this team will objectively have some really high results. Moving on to our team 3. This one might be a bit of a controversial one, but I think the potency on this team is so high that I could not put it any lower than 3. And this is going to be Hedge's team, coach of the Bellypult Boomers. This is consisting of Fluttermane, Torkoal, Dragonite, Hariyama, Slowking Galar, Charizard, Hisui Lilligant, Electros, Squawkabilly, and Stazbuck. Now, I will say right off the bat, this team does have a bit of an issue in terms of the the non-reliance on Torkoal. The second Torkoal is out of the picture, this team does kind of crumble. However, I feel like the Torkoal can be really well utilized here, even if it's just for a single turn or two. Whether it's the fast mode with things like Lilycole or Fluttermane plus Torkoal, you have really strong damage breakers outright. But Torkoal is also a really good Trick Room setter, and I think with things like Hariyama Glow King, you can get a really strong lead. Then you could Chilly Reception into Torkoal, which will then clear the snow anyway and bring in Torkoal for free in most cases here. I think as well, with mons like Charizard, you get a decent Tailwind mode that most teams probably won't exactly be preparing for, while also then just going for Charizard Heat Waves with Terra Fire and Solar Power. Like, this is a really good damage breaker that most teams will probably not just be assuming. Charizard can not only be the Tailwind setter, but it can also just shatter my whole team, because most people, when they see the Fire type, will probably just assume that Torkoal will do that. Dragonite here, I do think is a little bit wasted in terms of budget, purely because it's a 14-point Dragonite. It's a great mon. I still think it'll have a lot of presence on this team. It's a great check to a lot of things that will be boosted by Torkoal's Sun, but at the same time, though, for 14-point Dragonite, I would have really loved to see this next to a Chiampao. I think the team definitely did a lot that was a bit of a gamble here in terms of weakness stacking, for example, and the fact they didn't draft certain roles that might have otherwise been useful. But at the same time, though, I feel like the potency with the Sun in terms of how they drafted it allows for not only really good Trick Room options for a slow mode, but also really good fast options and multiple options for both those modes at that. This will be a team that I think definitely will be very deceptively strong, and I do expect a lot of really good results from it. Moving on to our number 2 team, as I mentioned, the 2 and 1 teams, I think honestly both could have been number 1 in my opinion, and it really just kind of depends on your perception of the board. But my number 2 team is going to go to Temple, who is going to be the coach of the Chicago Hydrants. This team consists of Iron Hands, Volcarona, Tinglu, Sylveon, Earthworm, Decidueye, Gothorita, Samurott, Zangoose, and Altaria. Now, right off the bat, I think the first thing that popped in my mind is this is probably someone who's actually competed in VGC. Looking at the results in this team, the only mon that I think is even kind of unviable here is Samurott, and even still, I would argue Samurott actually has a pretty decent place on this team, being a really good breaker thanks to sharpness, while also giving it a nice neutral speed that could be beneficial in Trick Room or in Tailwind here. And I do mention Tailwind because Volcarona is a pretty good deceptive Tailwind mon as well as Decidueye. Meanwhile, the team does have Gothorita, which is a really strong Trick Room option for this. In terms of Trick Room mode, you have things like Iron Hands, Tinglu, Earthworm, Gothorita, Samurott, all of which could be pretty decent mons, as well as Decidueye. Meanwhile, for Tailwind, you have things like Volcarona. You have, honestly, Iron Hands is a pretty strong Tailwind mon too. A lot of people don't really prep for Tailwind Iron Hands, but it's one of those things that it's bulky enough to actually take advantage of Tailwind despite that 50 base speed. And unlike a mon like Sylveon, for example, which does have at least a very easy way to take advantage of it thanks to how good a lot of the physical mons are, Iron Hands can just usually be 2, 3, 4 KO'd by most faster things anyway, even if they're really good breakers like Fluttermane thanks to your Terra options. But Iron Hands will typically just be fine in those matchups. So I think that realistically, this team is one of those things where you would look at it and think, oh, this leans very heavily Trick Room. But it's slow options are so good at being under Tailwind anyway that you could probably just outpace most teams unless they're really built around running Tailwind, which in that case you'd probably just lead into the Trick Room mode here. Gothorita is going to be a really good deceptively valuable support at 6 points here. Having Shadow Tag is going to be really valuable, and it does everything that normal Goth would need to do anyway, but for much cheaper. Because you're not looking at Gothitelle and thinking, oh, this is going to be a really good damage Pokemon. No, you're thinking of it for Fake Out, Shadow Tag, Trick Room, Heal Pulse, etc. And Gothorita will do all those roles well, but for a significantly better cost. So I do like Temple's team a lot. I think it's really incredible. If I was to be playing in this league, I would probably want to use this team. I think this is the team that I would feel the most comfortable with. And while I do think the number 1 team is slightly better, I think this would be the one that I would personally want to use, if not Amarillo's. So to you two, I guess, good job. You get the Live Award of the team that I would want to use the most. That is redeemable for absolutely nothing. You get no trophy or medal with it. You just get the knowledge of knowing that if you drop, I might ask Meme to take your team. And that's about all you get out of that. Moving on to our number 1 team, though, we do have Lars, coach of the Termanitar. Oh my god, I don't know why that was so hard to say. This team consists of Tornadus, Incarnate, Kingambit, Garchomp, Gothitelle, Rotom-Mow, Colossal, Inteleon, Crabominable, Masquerain, and Tinkatuff. Now, I will say, I actually do know Lars personally, but that has nothing to do with the ranking. I did remember I brought that up because I know that Lars specifically mentioned this was their first VGC draft, and I think they did a really good job, especially for the fact this is the first draft. I think Torn and Kingambit already were 2 mons that, frankly, in my opinion, should have both been round 1 picks. And I know that Lars had the 3rd pick overall, so Torn was a pretty given Pokemon. But the fact that Kingambit made it back nearly to the round 2 wheel, and then on top of that, Garchomp was the really strong round 3 pick there, I think is already incredible. Lars did a really good job, in my opinion, looking at value per round. Things like Inteleon, for example, might not have been the best Pokemon, but for round 4, when a lot of the really good fast options were already taken, and not many things really fit that much better here, Inteleon was just a really smart grab. Though I will say, I do think there might have been a couple better options, just in terms of complete viability. I think Lars did a great job at picking the best one for the draft. And not only this, but I think even in terms of the more gimmicky Pokemon, Lars has probably some of the best options that he could have gotten on the board. For example, with Colossal, having Inteleon here as a really weak Aqua Jet user will help with Colossal's Steam Engine, and having Torn as well to help with boosting for Tailwind for mons like Garchomp will probably be really valuable. Garchomp, in my opinion, is probably one of the best options that Torn could have been paired with as far as the draft setting goes. There's not really a lot of things better than it, besides, unless you happen to get like a Fluttermane with this, which would be insanity. And Fluttermane was picked before Lars's pick anyway, so it was completely impossible. I do think that overall, this team has a lot of good versatility, and I do think that teams will probably sleep on the Trick Room mode, because despite the fact this team doesn't exactly have a Trick Room presence, you'd think that, you know, with Torn, you have mons like Garchomp, Inteleon, Cole, even Kingambit has a similar presence to Iron Hands and Tailwind, where you can definitely make that threatening. For the Trick Room mode, you do still have mons like Kingambit and Crabominable as well, which I think will be deceptively strong on Trick Room. Having moves like Ice Hammer in close combat, that's a pretty impossible stab to switch around, and having that as your stab options with a really well-rounded coverage pool and the ability to take advantage for Terra Blast in case if you find any niche threats that might otherwise overwhelm you is really good. There's not a pick on this team I would actually change. I think everything was done pretty perfectly. The only changes I would probably make would be out of preference, just because I don't really like Rotom-Mow in any sort of setting, and I might ditch that for something else. But I do think it was a really strong pick on this team, having a really good ground check that doesn't necessarily need to be relying on just a resistance, but instead having Rotom-Mow have a good offensive presence into grounds, which could be valuable for potential Earthquake options since they are some of the strongest. It's a really good Disc-Quake partner for Garchomp as well, which is really huge. And unlike any other comparable electric types, I do think that Rotom-Mow probably did benefit Garchomp the best for also clearing things like bulky waters. It's a really good dozo check for a pretty cheap budget. And again, I think the roll compression here was really the biggest benefit here. When you look at Raichu in 10 points, sure, you do have a little bit better of an electric type overall. It's going to give a little bit more of a presence to Garchomp, but not having a Disc-Quake partner kind of sucks because you can't really just Earthquake right into that without going for Terra Flying. Same for mons like Kilowattrel, for example. I mean, Kilowattrel was just a flat-out more expensive Pokemon. I think Kilowattrel was like, what, 12 points if I remember correctly? Yeah, it was 12 points. I called that right on the dot. And then even for like other 10-point options, things like Serena and Vivian, while they could have been Earthquake partners for Garchomp, they don't really offer any benefit to, well, they don't really benefit from Garchomp just being on the field there, outside of maybe Vivian just being a good Palm Puff and Friend Guard option for that. But the point being is that even other comparable options, both more expensive and even lower, things like Jolteon, for example, could have been another electric that could have been lower point at 8. I think that this was the best option despite personal beliefs on each of the Pokemon. And I think that Lars did an incredible job with these picks, and it really just goes to show in the synergy, and I would be shocked if this team team does not end up in the top 3 ranked at the end of the season. But let me know your guys' thoughts down below, or just ping me in the PGL server. I am in there despite not saying a lot these days. I would love to get your guys' opinions on the teams overall and see what you guys think of the rankings. If you enjoyed, of course, like and subscribe to the PGL YouTube. Thank you guys so much for having me on again. I love doing these power rankings for you guys, and I will see you guys whenever Meme asks me to do another power ranking for the PGL. Peace out, guys.